2 of American Literature. This week, you'll be beginning with this week's lecture, hopefully. That's what you're starting right now. Next, I would like you to actively read the text we'll be thinking about this week. The first text we're going to think about is the Iroquois creation story. Next, I'd like you to read John Smith's account of the General History of Virginia, which was written in 1612, or published in 1612, but accounts earlier dates in the 1600s. And then I'd like you to read this website, which is part of the Jamestown National Park. Then, after that, I'd like you to participate in this week's discussion. Will the real Pocahontas please stand up? Also not listed here is a resource I'll be posting. It's a virtual tour of the history of Jamestown, which was one of the first settlements. So I just want to remind you, in this class, you will be reading a lot of texts. And when you read, you must actively read these texts in order to participate well in our online discussions, which are much like classroom discussions. You will need to have already done this work in advance. So before you participate in discussions, plan on reading these texts that we're reading for class once, maybe even twice, while taking notes. So you should know when and where each text was written, what time it was written about, right? So for example, John Smith's account was published years later. It's important to know that he's talking about an earlier time. You need to know what genre it is. Is it fiction or nonfiction, right? Not that always is exactly a clear delineation of truth when you write in nonfiction. Or is it poetry or drama? Want to know what the title is, and I want you to think about the title before you start reading. What could it mean? Who wrote the text? Do you know anything about this person? Have you ever heard of John Smith? And if so, where? And think about it to yourself. Write down your notes. Why do you think that this person wrote this text? I want you to think about it. What was the purpose involved in this text? Because that will slant the way that this text comes across. What is the author trying to communicate through the text? Is there an underlining meaning? Is there a subtext? What other writings has this author drawn upon in order to write this text? What text is this text talking back to? Or what text does this text influence? Remember, American literature is always talking to other texts within it, its canon. And when you're talking about a text from early American literature, you can also think about English texts that the authors who wrote these texts would have read. What phrases, passages stick out to you and why? Pay attention to them, because when you're in the discussion forum, you can go back to these and quote them in your actual response. What symbols or reoccurring themes do you find in this text? In what ways is this text valuable? What can we learn from it? What cultural value does it have? What historic value does it have? Okay, I really want you to think about that. We will be coming back to these texts when we write our papers, so the more time you spend on it now, the easier it'll be to come up with paper topics. Also remember, you need to look up any words you're not familiar with and write down the definitions. Also, please always read the background information about the author. It's very important. All right. I won't say that every single week, but I want to make sure that you guys understand that I expect you to actively read. So let's go over last week's readings. I really enjoyed getting to know you guys in our first online forum, discussion forum. Good job jumping in there. And I hope I was able to direct some of you towards what type of posts I'd like you to write for this class. Last week we read the relation of Alvar Nuñez Cabeza de Vaca, and as many of you saw, this text was a lot like Homer's Odyssey, right? An epic, heroic tale of wandering through exotic locales that leads the protagonist to a profound sense of self-discovery, right? He realizes that he he thinks more anthropologically, right, than as a conqueror, which is how most of the Spanish explorers were coming to the Americas as a place to conquer. And this means that this text offers us an unorthodox perspective for his time. He shows in this text an interest in the lives of women. Note, the passages where he points out what it was like to lose a child, right? And makes an effort to understand American Indian groups and their differences. This is important because not all of the texts from this time were doing so. The second text we looked at was the Navajo creation story. The Navajo immigrated to the American Southwest around 1000 CE. This is when they encountered the Pueblo people that is documented in this origin story. The account of cultural contact between the Navajo and the Pueblo in this origin myth gives us a different version of pre-Columbian North America, that means before Columbus got here, than the one that we're familiar with, or most of us are familiar with. It shows us that North American cultures weren't all static. They weren't unchanging societies that European explorers stumbled into and then finally documented. This story describes a place of conflict, change, adaptation, and evolution. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Navajo creation story when I talk about the Iroquois creation story we'll be reading for this week. Finally, Anne Bradstreet's poem, Before the Birth of One of Her Children. It's important to think about, and we're going to be coming back to Puritan writing after this week. Next week we'll be diving back into some of the sermons and also some poetry as well. But it's important to know that Puritan women were expected to be modest, meek, submissive, virtuous, obedient, and kind, and to solely occupied with supervising and maintaining the home, cooking, sometimes brewing and dairying and bearing and rearing children. She was expected to suffer all of these in silence, and Bradstreet goes against this norm. She gives us a different perspective. She tells us about what it's like to suffer. She also tells us what it's like to be a woman. And in a time when women had absolutely no legal representation and were expected to act in this way, it was extraordinary that Bradstreet became as popular as she did. It's also important when you read this poem to think about the enormous medical risks that were involved with childbirth. More than half of women who gave birth at this time died. And the infant mortality rate was also very high. If a mother died while giving birth, often there weren't orphanages, right? There weren't foster children services available. There was no welfare. The child could just die because there was no way to support that child because it was such a meager environment. So the feelings, the strong feelings she expresses in this poem are it's hard for us to imagine how vivid and real that they are. So that was last week was kind of like a jumping off point to get us thinking about the differing views of American history and American literature as it began. This week, we're going to also look at a differing view. We're going to look at the Iroquois creation story, which is a bit different from the Navajo creation story. We're also going to read John Smith's early settlements, John Smith, The General History of Virginia, which was published in 1612. And we're going to look at a website that talks about the facts in regards to the Jamestown settlement that John Smith is writing about. I want you to think about the fact that in these early texts that we're looking at, I think your idea of literature probably up until this point is that literature is made up of fiction texts, novels and short stories, some poems, maybe a play or two, right? But there's a lot more texts that make up the canon of American literature, especially during this time period. Nonfiction accounts are constructed, and nonfiction letters, sermons, these are all things we're going to be looking at a lot in these early weeks. And what I want you to pay attention to is nonfiction accounts they're constructed just like fictional texts, especially during this time period. Uh, they have protagonists and antagonists. They have main characters and the forces that push against those main characters or people, right? They have plots that are filled with action, conflict, and growth. Sermons and letters share the imaginative expressiveness of lyric poetry, including the self-reflective posture that externalizes the internalized, and an economy of language, and the use of words and phrases that are charged with multiple meanings. So today we're going to be talking about the Iroquois creation story. When you read this, I know many of us had a hard time reading the Navajo creation myth. And I think it's because when you read something just out of the blue like that, sometimes it's hard to, especially something that challenges the structure that we are used to. Sometimes it's hard to just accept its structure, even because it's so different. So this week, what I challenge you to think about is, how is the Iroquois creation story different from the Christian creation story that's found in the book of Genesis? Many of us are familiar with this. If you're not familiar with it, you could easily find, you can read it. I would love for you to read it. If you don't have time to read it, you can easily find a Wikipedia page on the book of Genesis that would tell you the plot points in this story. One thing to think about when you're reading the Iroquois creation story, and I strongly recommend that as you're reading this story, have a piece of paper next to you and make a graph that has 4 quadrants. And I want you to diagram the beginning of the story where the pregnant woman falls through to the lower world and show her down in the bottom quadrant, right? I want you to visually think through this story, because you may get confused as you did in the Navajo, as some of you did in the Navajo creation story. I want you to think about these themes as you're reading. The process of creation versus the completed act by the Creator. In the Western tradition, the completed act by the Creator is God commanded something and it was done. Whereas in the Iroquois creation story, the process of creation is in the hands of the people. In this story, the origins of the world are linked to women. And it's important to note that the Iroquois were matrilineal. That means that the lineage was passed on through the female side of the family. The monsters in this story aren't like the devils of hell, right? They help the fallen woman give birth. Man and woman are created at the same time. The good twin creates 2 images of the dust of the ground in his own likeness, unlike the single male image of the Western god, where the female image is later created from a rib of the male. So pay attention to these details. Make notes in your text as you're reading. Think about how this creation story is different. How is it the same as the Navajo story? How is it different from the Navajo story? How is it similar to the creation story found in the book of Genesis? How is it different? Remember when you're writing, especially if you are of the Christian faith, sometimes it's hard for us to look at the book of Genesis as a piece of literature, but that is very important when you're looking at it in the process of reading it for this class. Another thing I want you to think about is, who are the main characters or the protagonists in the Iroquois creation story? It's some people immediately say it's the woman who fell from the sky, right? Or it's the good twin who created people, or it's the turtle that supported the woman, right? Or it's the bad twin, right? It's hard to locate the exact protagonists in the story, and the reason why is there's no human agency. The theme of the story is that there's no human agency without help from a variety of participants, and that all creative powers must know their limits. So think about this as you're reading the story, and very much I'd like you to think collectively. We will be coming back to these creation stories as we move on further in the semester, so don't lose touch with these. We are not discussing these in our discussion forum this week, but we will be coming back to them. The next thing we're going to be thinking about are early settlements. John Smith is a famous name from this era. He wrote about the Jamestown settlement in the General History of Virginia, which was published in 1612. This is an American adventure story. You can compare it to the previous the previous account, Cabeza de Vaca, that we read. You can compare the perspective in this story. Is this I want you to think, is this an anthropological view or is it a conqueror view? Is that which view is he taking? I also want you to think about the fictional techniques that John Smith is using. Is it historical account or is it just a good story? Or is it both? Here's a quote from his biographer, Philip L. Barbour. Captain John Smith has lived on in legend far more thrillingly than even he could have foreseen. Much has been made largely by ill-formed people of trivial inconsequences in his narratives, and controversy has at times raged rather absurdly. To be sure, much of what John Smith wrote was exaggerated. Rare indeed was the man who wrote in Stuart times, this is the era when he was writing, without ornament, without exuberance. Let it only be said that nothing John Smith wrote has yet found to be a lie. So that's important. This is how his biographer sees what John Smith wrote. What's important also to note in this particular piece of literature is the shift in this narrative is from exploration to settlement. So unlike Cabeza de Vaca, who was exploring, right? John Smith is settling. He has come to set up a settlement and to make money for England. Pay close attention to how John Smith describes his encounter with Pocahontas. How accurate do you think his account is? I've included a link here, and it's also on your reading list, to a resource from the Jamestown State Park, or I think it's the state park, that gives us facts about these stories and an alternative version of events. So for discussion assignment number 2, this week I want to practice using evidence from the text to support an argument. Below are 3 questions, or to the right are 3 questions I'd like you to answer in your first post. Please answer these questions using complete sentences, proper spelling, and grammar. Please support the points you make using quotations from the text. Please cite the page number where you found the quotations in MLA format. If you have questions about MLA format, remember, you can go to the Al Purdue website, or you can just stop by the Writing Center in room 832 on campus. They have handouts that you can just grab and go. Your first post, which should be at least 250 words. Remember, at least means average, C, right? It's due by Thursday at 11:59 p.m. Please also respond to at least 3 of your peers' posts by Monday at 11:59 p.m. That's next Monday. Your responses must add to the conversation by referencing a point your peer made and the text he or she is referring to. Please use quotations to support the points that you make. I want to be very, very clear about how seriously I take these discussions. It's the place where I get to see your critical thinking happening. I get to see your comprehension of the text. If you just use the app on your phone, which is great, but if you just use that and text out a few answers to these questions, you will not get passing grades on these discussion forums. The idea behind this, think of these posts as almost like a response paper. I want you to do active reading, take notes while reading, think about these questions, and then come back and write answers where you've critically thought about what you're going to say. Use spell check. Use evidence from the text to support claims that you make in your statements. So these are your 3 questions for this week. Smith's explorations unfolded during a golden age of English theater, the Stuart Age. What hints of theatrical thinking do you see in Smith's account of his own adventure? He was actually part of the Elizabethan age. How accurate is John Smith's account about the Jamestown settlement and his encounters with the Powhatan Indians? Who was Pocahontas according to Smith and according to the Jamestown's website? Which version do you feel is more accurate and why? Most of you have probably seen the Disney version of Pocahontas, and you're welcome to bring in those views. One thing I definitely want to say, though, is don't just tell me your opinions about these texts. I love that the texts are making you feel something, but don't just say, I like it, I don't like it. That doesn't give us critical insight into the text. You have to show us, if you think that a text is difficult to follow because it doesn't follow a linear plot, then give us evidence of this and show us how that affects the reader's understanding of the text. We don't read literature in order to give ourselves, in order to feel like we like something or dislike something. In reality, for this class, it doesn't matter if you like or dislike something. Although I want you to like these texts and I want you to feel passionately about them, one way or the other. When you write these posts, don't rely on your emotion. Rather, rely on evidence from the text to support what you're saying. This is how we write as literary scholars, and that's what you'll be doing when you write papers for this class. All right, guys, that's it for this week. As usual, if you have any questions, please email me or set up an appointment time. I'd be happy to meet with you over the phone. I am still off campus this week, and I will be through next week. I'll be back on campus on September 5th. It's a pleasure to work with you all, and I look forward to seeing your discussion posts online.